So, despite colossal killer earthquakes, flash floods, and wildfires everywhere, which in themselves might fully engage all our energy, humanity is instead tied up in its own confrontation and divisiveness. And the energy and the effort required to resolve those differences is not just wearying and time-consuming, it crowds out the better work. And that's really disappointing. We are in the middle of a number of significant court cases, not about petty crime like stealing a bicycle or being drunk and disorderly, but about some existential issues like deliberately driving a truck into a family out for a walk and killing 4 people, or deliberately shutting down a city center for the better part of a month for reasons nobody seems able to articulate or even to agree upon. Both those cases came to court last Monday, one in Windsor, Ontario, and the other in Ottawa. And the motivation of the accused is unclear. Were they simply about murder for cause and about making a nuisance, or were the reasons rather more sinister? Was it simply murder and mayhem, or was it white-hot hate and sponsored anarchy? And all of the accused in those 2 cases have pleaded or pled not guilty. And not to dwell on it particularly, but the same unreasoning confrontation and discord is on display in the nearby United States. Individuals found guilty of contempt of court or slander and fined for it leave the courtroom and promptly double down in anger and repeat the slander and continue the contempt, even at risk of added fines. It seems more and more the case that people who are carefully given the benefit of generous justice and proved by the evidence to be guilty of the charge against them absolutely refuse to acknowledge that guilt. There's no admission of the guilt, there's no remorse, and there's certainly no apology. And consequently, neither is there forgiveness. It's all rather bewildering. Now, in the gospel today, Jesus talks about forgiveness. And he uses the topic of debt or indebtedness to illuminate how forgiveness works. It requires a truly generous spirit, and it requires giving something up, and at the same time, the recipient of the gift of forgiveness is expected to learn and likewise be generous and forgiving. The king forgave his servant, but the servant did not in turn forgive the man who owed him money. Made a mistake. And it's right there in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them who trespass against us. And in the passage from St. Paul's letter to the Romans today, St. Paul writes repeatedly about not judging or passing judgment on others. Why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? Or you? Why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. So I have in mind 2 pages. On the one are the words of the legal equation of justice, and on the other are the words of the ecclesial balance. On the legal side, we have words like crime and punishment, accusation and evidence, judgment and guilt or not, and acquittal or sentencing. And on the second page are the other words of the other equation, that moral equation, and the words are sin and trespass, confession, penitence, forgiveness, and absolution. And the first page is rather one-directional. The judicial system identifies the crime, specifies the accusation, lays out the evidence, and passes judgment and decides sentencing. But the second page is more give and take. requiring the recognition of the trespass, admission and confession and penitence, which earns forgiveness and absolution in return. The state is all about justice with a capital J, but God is much more about reconciliation, about confession and forgiveness and absolution. My wife, Patricia that is, Trish, comes with a very precise moral compass. I'm not sure whether she inherited it or learned it from her mother, who was a witch, or whether it's part of her ethnic background. And she likes to remind me that Welsh women are devoted to their husbands as long as their husbands are devoted to them. And that if the husband's devotion starts to waver, she'll burn the house down. And one day we were in church together, listening to a priest preaching. It was a Good Friday, I remember. And he exhorted the congregation to remember 4 things to say when you have wronged or enraged your spouse. 4 things. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. And those 4 things are really reflective of confession, penance, forgiveness, and absolution. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you. And from time to time, Trish will ask me out of the blue, what are the 4 things? And I will stutter and stumble, and I can remember 3, and she gets furious that I don't remember all 4. It's an issue between the 2 of us. So forgiveness. Who can forgive the murderer? Who can forgive the mischief maker? Who can forgive the slanderer? Who can forgive the liar? Who can forgive the bully? They might think they can forgive themselves. They might think their friends can forgive them. They might think the fine they paid forgives them, or the time they spend in jail. They might think that a pardon is forgiveness. Or is forgiveness only possible from the victim or from God? That illustration of how forgiveness works, described by Jesus in the case of a debt, is timely, I think, especially in this time of rising interest rates, when a comfortable mortgage can suddenly become a foreclosure nightmare. And I was going to ask everyone present how many here owe money or have money owed them. And I'm sure if we don't owe money now, we used to. And if people didn't owe us money, they used to. And it's easy for someone to write that famous line, neither a borrower nor a lender be. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. And I turned to my wife yesterday and I said, who wrote that? Thinking to impress her. And she said, oh, that was Polonius talking to Laertes in the first act of Hamlet, written by Shakespeare. And they say those lines written by Shakespeare were more than likely meant to be less than serious, because Polonius was a father sending his son Laertes off to university, and he was giving him some advice, but Polonius, being a rather sordid character, was being very hypocritical when he said, neither a borrower nor a lender be. And it seems we can't avoid borrowing or lending. And Jesus, speaking about indebtedness and forgiveness, would well have known the Jewish tradition of Jubilee, when after 7 times 7 years, that is every 50 years, there was to be forgiveness, including of outstanding debt. So when Jesus answers Peter's question, how many times are we to forgive, Jesus' over-the-top reply is not just 7 times, but 77 times or 7 times 7. Forgiveness is thus not just about something as uniquely as important as debt, an overdue debt, as it is more about all the other wrongs that divide and wound people. Think of the grievances each of us carry around that might be erased by forgiveness. Whoever it was that backed into your car and drove away, or the loan you made to a friend that she has apparently forgotten, or the verbal slight that someone laid on you that you weren't supposed to notice. So why not reflect on those slights one more time, and then quietly in prayer forgive them all. Forgive and forget and heal the wounds. There was one time that some in-laws of mine were really rude to me, deliberately embarrassed me in public in a church, and were pleased with themselves for doing so. Later they learned the truth. Some years later, learned the truth and wanted to apologize to me. And it was nice of them to try to put things right. And they turned to me and said, "Will you forgive us?" Fully expecting me to do so. And they sat there anticipating my forgiveness. And I refused. "What you did was awful," I said. "I am really not ready to forgive that." And they were shocked. I remember them being almost literally frozen in shock. I never saw them again. Actually, they died not long after. Clearly, I should have forgiven them. It would have been absolution for them, and it would have been absolution for me. Forgiveness is healing for the one to whom it is given and to the giver. So Jesus was right again. Amen.